Third section of the Aeroplane in War by Claude Grahame-White and Harper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The growing air fleets of foreign nations. 1. Activity in France. 200 machines at the end of 1911. 1,000 promised by the year 1914. Practically all leading nations, with the exception of Great Britain, are now equipping themselves on an adequate scale with the war aeroplane. At the time of the autumn maneuvers in 1910, France possessed about a dozen aeroplanes, but she soon increased this number, being full of enthusiasm and determined upon a strong aerial policy. Thus, an official report, which was presented at the end of 1910, showed that the French authorities had increased their fleet of machines in 2 or 3 months from a dozen to 32. The list of the French war aeroplanes at this time was, it is interesting to note, made up as follows: Wright biplanes 5, Blériot monoplanes 4, H. Farman biplanes 11, M. Farman biplanes 4, Béguet biplanes 2, Summer biplanes 4, Antoinette monoplanes 2. To pilot these 32 aeroplanes, there were at this time 34 fully qualified military airmen. The activity which prevailed at the end of 1910 among the aeroplane manufacturers in France is revealed in the report of one well-known maker, Mr. Henry Farman. He stated on 6 December 1910 that he had received orders for military machines as follows: French government 35 aeroplanes, Russian government 20 aeroplanes, Spanish government 3 aeroplanes, Italian government 2 aeroplanes, Belgian government 1 aeroplane, Japanese government 1 aeroplane, British government 1 aeroplane. The commanding position of France in this one list, as compared with the single order of Great Britain, forms an illustration of the attitude of the two countries at this time towards military airmanship. At M. Blériot's flying school at Pau, early in February 1911, the French government had more than 20 officers learning to become airmen. No more striking indication could be found of the determination of this country to be in the forefront in aviation. Early in the summer of 1911, the French War Minister authorized the purchase of close upon 150 aeroplanes. Of these machines, nearly 100 were, at this time, actually in the possession of the military authorities. Among the orders placed with French manufacturers was one for 80 monoplanes. This was secured by Monsieur Louis Blériot. 2 types of machine were presented in this large commission, one being a 2-seated machine and the other a single-seated craft capable of high speed. To Mr. Henry Farman, whose biplane had performed so meritoriously in the 1910 Picardy maneuvers, an order was placed for 40 war machines, and the French government's large order was made up of a number of other machines. With her energetic method of sending officers in squads to learn flying at the various schools, it was not long before France found herself in possession of a corps of at least 100 fully qualified airmen. These, as a matter of fact, she possessed quite early in the summer of 1911. The business-like way in which she set herself the task of becoming the premier nation in the development of flying was especially notable at this time. Military commissions were appointed to visit the various aerodromes throughout France and inspect all aeroplanes built. In the case where a machine had been purchased, one of these military commissions came to the flying ground on a specified date and passed the aircraft through a series of tests. These experiments had to be carried out by the constructor of the aeroplane before the government would take delivery of his machine. One instance of this excellent policy is sufficient. In April, 1911, a military commission of several officers made a journey to the Brayel aerodrome. Here, awaiting their inspection, were a couple of biplanes which the French authorities had decided to buy. After the officers had examined the machines, the professional pilots of the flying school carried out a series of maneuvers. The officers noted, for example, how long it took a machine to ascend to an altitude of 1,000 feet. The specified load had to be lifted by each aeroplane. It was also necessary that it should attain a stipulated speed. When these conditions were fulfilled, and not before, the officers formally took over the aeroplanes on behalf of their government. With what determination this task of increasing the aerial armament of France was pressed forward may be gauged by the work of one of these military commissions which visited the Pau aerodrome during the summer of 1911. No fewer than 8 two-seated war monoplanes were waiting for their inspection, and all 8 machines were tested and passed in the course of a day's flying. The spirit which animated France in regard to this question of military aviation is evidenced by the words of M. Clementel when placing an official report before the French Chamber. He declared, "The aeroplane has proved that it is a marvelous instrument of war, a new arm in our military organization. We now possess an incontestable superiority in aviation, and this we hope to continue for a long period. We must maintain this advance. The sacrifices imposed on us in this matter are as useful as they are necessary." This indeed supplies the keynote to the enthusiasm of the French for war aeroplanes. By the end of the year 1911, the War Minister possessed a fleet of more than 200 war aeroplanes and a corps of officers fully trained to pilot them and act as observers. After French tests of military aeroplanes in October 1911, which will be described in the next section, there was a generous distribution of orders for machines. Early in 1912, the French military authorities had 234 war aeroplanes at their disposal, and the financial grant for the year placed to £920,000 for the purposes of military flying. In addition, there was a scheme on foot to augment the number of war machines. By the aid of public subscription, this quite soon approached a sum of £100,000. The latest plan of the French government is to form a large regiment of military airmen, and in this connection more than 300 new aeroplanes have been ordered for delivery before the end of 1912. Sheds to accommodate machines are springing up all over the country. Quite early in 1912, nearly 300 officers had obtained pilot certificates from the French Aero Club. So far as can be ascertained, the military aeroplanes in France will number appreciably more than 400 at the end of this year, and it must be remembered that in time of war this country could call upon nearly 1,000 privately owned machines. The policy in France may be summarized in the statement that the government aimed to create an air fleet of at least 1,000 machines by the end of the year 1914. In 1917, it is anticipated, the French air fleet will approach in numbers several thousand machines. Eventualities, of course, govern such a program. It may, for example, should any remarkable development of aviation take place, be appreciably augmented. What the limit of utility of an air fleet may be, only the practical work of war will show. For reconnoitering, it is clear that very large squadrons of machines divided amongst the various sections of an army will be employed. Then there is the question of using aeroplanes for dispatch carrying and for directing artillery fire, to say nothing of their probable employment for destructive work and perhaps in the transport of troops. Another crucial point must also be borne in mind, to which detailed reference will be made later. If, as is practically certain, a conflict takes place between the aerial forces of two armies, it is likely to be the larger of the two fleets of machines, other things being equal, which will emerge victorious. Therefore it is impossible at present to lay down any rule as to limiting the number of war aeroplanes. No country can stay its hand. The wise policy surely is to be well armed in view of eventualities. If a great war comes, then and only then can the strength of an air fleet be tested adequately. 2. The great French tests of military aeroplanes. Striking results obtained. Era of fast, airworthy, weight-carrying machines. Any account of the splendid progress in military flying which has been made in France would not be complete without a reference to the trials of war aeroplanes which were carried out at Reims in October 1911. In prizes and prospective orders for machines, more than £50,000 have been set aside, and an astonishing large number of French makers, bearing striking testimony to the progress of aviation in that country, brought their machines together. Despite bad weather, a series of tests which were highly instructive and important were carried out. One of the French aims in the organization of these contests was to encourage the construction of a speedy, airworthy machine capable of carrying a pilot and passenger and flying long distances when fully loaded. The tests were most interesting as showing the high state of efficiency to which airplanes had attained. Quite a number of machines, for example, were able to effect a regular series of non-stop flights of 300 kilometers, 187.5 miles, when carrying a pilot and observer. A surprising number also were able to ascend to a height of 1,640 feet in 15 minutes, a remarkable indication of the reserve of power they possessed. One difficult feat was set the competing machines. This was that they should rise, when fully loaded, from a plowed field. Hitherto, of course, only smooth ground had been considered suitable for the ascent of a machine. An appreciable number passed even this test successfully. Their ability to do so was due to the fitting of exceptionally strong landing devices of the wheel and skid type, and to ample engine power. In all, 7 aeroplanes emerged triumphantly from all the trials imposed. The winning machine, which owed its final triumph to its high speed, was the Nieuport monoplane. Even when heavily laden with pilot, passenger, and fuel, it flew across country at the rate of more than 70 miles an hour. One of the most impressive features of the trials was the reliability shown by the competing machines. They made voyage after voyage with the regularity of express trains. The striking aspect of the tests, indeed, was the practical demonstration of the fact that not one French builder, but dozens, could make a thoroughly efficient war aeroplane. It was shown conclusively also that it is no longer necessary to wait for calm weather before embarking upon aeroplane flights. In astonishingly high winds, blowing in some cases at a velocity of approximately 40 miles an hour, the large military machines went out, and ascending 1,000 or 1,500 feet, battled triumphantly against vicious gusts. A striking point in connection with the competition was the big horsepower of the engines employed. There was a vivid contrast indeed between the motors now used and the little 3-cylindered 25 horsepower engine with which Blériot crossed the Channel in 1909. Many of the machines taking part in the contest were fitted with 14-cylinder 100 horsepower Gnome motors, and some employed even higher power than this, being equipped with engines developing 140 horsepower. Such big power was, of course, necessary in view of the loads which were carried and the arduous nature of some of the tests. To indicate the weights raised, it may be mentioned that the Béguet biplane, which was driven by 140 horsepower Gnome, weighed with pilot, 2 passengers, and fuel aboard 2,420 pounds. Representatives from all the great countries in the world, including Great Britain, visited Reims to witness these military tests, and the French manufacturers who produced successful machines were quickly supplied with sufficient orders to keep their factories busy for a long time to come. The value of the flying work accomplished in these trials and the obvious practicability of military machines stimulated interest not only in France, but in Russia, Germany, and other countries. It was undoubtedly the means of determining our War Office to make a move in view of what was achieved at Reims. In fact, there no longer remained any possible excuse for refraining from a constructive policy in military aviation. 3. Germany's aerial policy, secret energies in creating a fleet of war aeroplanes, rivalry with France. Leaving France for the moment, we may now turn to a consideration of Germany's advance in the matter of military flying. Here, first of all, we shall need to consider an interesting question. It concerns the relative merits of the dirigible balloon and the aeroplane. Although in this book we are concerned exclusively with the heavier than air machine, it is certainly necessary to mention the dirigible at this point, in explanation of the fact that Germany almost abandoned her airship policy after the French maneuvers in the autumn of 1910 in favor of the aeroplane. She was not led to take this step after spending many thousands of pounds upon dirigibles without mature consideration. Among her advisers in matters of aviation, Germany possessed many particularly staunch and even obstinate supporters of the airship. These refused at first to admit the enormous strides which the aeroplane was making, but soon it was impossible to turn a blind eye towards them, and so came a reversal of German policy. The facts of the case could not indeed be controverted. While the aeroplane leaped to the front during 1910, the airship made practically no forward strides at all. In comparison with the aeroplane, it was ruinously costly. It required large crews of men to handle it. It needed huge garages dotted about the country at all strategic points. It was slow flying as compared with the aeroplane. It offered a far easier target to artillery fire from below. The advantages which were claimed for it over the aeroplane were that it could remain in the air longer and that observations could be carried out from it in a more leisurely fashion than from the heavier than air machine. But the German War Office is notoriously shrewd in all matters appertaining to modern warfare. When it was seen that a mistaken policy was being pursued in spending large sums upon unwieldy dirigibles, a new plan was quickly evolved, and that was to overtake France in the creation of a fleet of war aeroplanes. It was in November 1910 that the German military authorities began to purchase machines. They then placed orders for 5 or 6 aeroplanes, mostly biplanes. This was quickly followed a month later by an order for nearly 20 Etrich monoplanes, strongly built, extremely efficient machines constructed in Austria. Military experts in Germany had by this time arrived at an approximate estimate of what should be the salient features of an aeroplane for war purposes. They stated that machine should be of as simple a construction as possible and very strong. They declared high speed to be an essential, and they demanded also that machines should be able to carry appreciable weights. It was characteristic of Germany that she should make steady progress once the decision had been arrived at to develop the aeroplane. Thus, in February 1911, it became known that 7 military airmen had in 1 week obtained their certificates of proficiency at the Johannisthal and Bork aerodromes. 3 of these pilots were using Wright biplanes. It was just about this time, too, that Germany placed an order in France for several Firman biplanes. By the spring of 1911, the German War Office had assembled a fleet of close upon 50 aeroplanes. Nearly half of them were Etrich monoplanes of the type previously mentioned. Metal now entered very largely into the framework of these machines. They were heavily engined and fast in flight and could easily raise a reconnoitering officer in addition to the pilot and an engineer to attend to the motor as well. In March 1911, so as to hasten forward the work of training officers to fly, the German Minister of War sent 50 or 60 unmarried lieutenants to the Dobritz military aviation camp. Here, while they were learning to fly, these officers received a special allowance. The military authorities also came to the conclusion at this time that it would be wise to arrange for an aviation section at all the garrisons in Germany which had suitable parade grounds attached to them. It was decided in May 1911 to spend large sums of money upon the purchase of new types of military aeroplanes, and the officers who had already learned to fly were encouraged to design machines embodying ideas formed during their period of tuition. At the same time, in order to encourage a general study of flying in Germany, the War Office made up its mind to contribute special prizes to the various cross-country contests then in process of arrangement. Going ahead with such determination, it was not surprising to find that in August 1911, Germany had established a fleet of nearly 80 aeroplanes, and the total of her officer airmen a month later approached the same figure. The Kaiser himself had by this time become greatly interested in the development of heavier-than-air machines for war purposes, and he thoroughly approved of the forward policy which had been initiated. At the end of the summer of 1911, Germany had quite 100 aeroplanes either on hand or in order, and her list of army airmen had grown appreciably. Recently, however, development in Germany, so far as aeroplanes are concerned, has been kept more or less secret. Information regarding tests which have been carried out has been carefully withheld. The results of several carefully organized reconnoitering flights have not, for instance, been allowed to leak out. But this much is known. During 1912, Germany will spend a sum of £640,000 upon the development of her aeroplane service. The Kaiser himself now offers a prize of £2,500 for the best aeroplane motor of German construction. It seems fairly clear, indeed, that Germany has now set herself the task of keeping pace with France in the development of military airmanship. A great point is made by the German War Office of encouraging the production of entirely German-built airplanes, and much experimental work is now being conducted. This much is certain: there is the greatest activity in Germany in regard to military aeroplaning. No stone is being left unturned, indeed, to produce a thoroughly efficient military machine, and the training of army airmen is steadily pursued. Many estimates have recently been made as to the strength of the German air fleet. One credits Germany with 300 war airplanes, another with nearly 200. The most reliable figure would appear to be a little in excess of 100 machines. Dirigible balloon work also still continues. It has been reported, in fact, that German military experts have overcome some of the difficulties of the rigid type, and that heights of over 6,000 feet are now attained with them. It was indeed only in January that France was warned by a well-known advocate of dirigible balloons to beware of the secret development of lighter-than-air craft in Germany. The destructive possibilities of a fleet of hostile dirigibles sailing across the German frontier into France and raining down missiles were pictured. But in this regard it is certainly pertinent to inquire what the French fleet of airplanes would be doing while such an attack was in progress. 4. Progress in Russia, America, and other countries. England's position in the autumn of 1911. The country which next merits attention as a keen, observant student of the value of the aeroplane for war purposes is Russia. The Russian military authorities recognized the importance of this new weapon early in 1911, and the steps taken to deal with the question were eminently practical. The Duma Committee of National Defense approved an expenditure of nearly £1 million upon military aviation. Since then, Russia has been acquiring aeroplanes and training airmen at a great rate. A sum of £25,000 a year for 3 years was voted exclusively for the building of experimental machines of a military type, in order that aircraft on original lines might be evolved. It was also decided to spend £2,500 a year in employing skilled instructors. Military air stations were at the same time established at Kiev, Odessa, Sebastopol, and Tiflis. Having thus made the first move towards creating an efficient air corps, the Russian government sent a commission of military officers on a tour of the French flying grounds in order that they might see the best work being produced by the aeroplane manufacturers. While in France, this commission purchased a number of machines of various types. They visited England also, and after inspecting the biplanes built by the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company at Bristol, ordered several military-type machines of this make. By May 1911, Russia had acquired 40 machines and was using them to teach a large number of officers to fly. A determination has been expressed to have a fleet of several hundred airplanes by the forthcoming flying season. The activities of other nations also present an interesting study. Take America, for example. In this country, despite the wonderful example set by the Wright brothers, military flying languished until towards the end of 1910. Then came a somewhat tardy vote for the purchase of a few machines and general development. In the beginning of 1911, Mr. Dickinson, the United States War Secretary, returned from a visit to France, where he had seen what the French war airplanes were accomplishing, and had enjoyed a flight upon a military machine at Chalons. He promptly recommended a more generous money grant, and the result has been that machines have been bought, while officers are now learning to fly. In a recent speech, Brigadier General James Allen, of the American Signal Corps, in connection with which the Air Corps is operated, said, "It is the ultimate intention, I believe, to teach aviation to several thousand army men." For the year ending June 1912, a sum of $125,000 was voted for the aeronautical work of the American Army. Austrian military experts have been very energetic in their study of flying. In November 1910, war airplanes were ordered, and it was then specified that each machine must fly for 2 hours without descending at the rate of 44 miles an hour. It was also stipulated that the aeroplane should be dismantled in an hour and rebuilt in 2 hours. During 1911, Austria operated 2 military air stations and now possesses an excellent fleet of war airplanes. Italian interest in military aviation has been keen from the outset. In the summer of 1911, at the Sant'Ocel military aerodrome, a number of officers were training, and a variety of machines were in use. Since then, also, definite progress has been made, and Italy quickly reaped the reward of her aeronautical labors in the war with Turkey. A reference to the work of airplanes in Tripoli will, however, be found in a later section. In March 1911, Japan placed orders in France for nearly 20 war airplanes. This was in addition to a previous purchase in Berlin of a number of Wright biplanes. Japanese officers have been learning to fly in large numbers lately, both in France and Germany. Spain must not be forgotten. She has bought a number of machines in France and is now training a corps of officer airmen. And what about England? It is sufficient to say for purposes of direct comparison in this section that for the autumn maneuvers of 1911, which were abandoned owing to the drought, the War Office had only half a dozen qualified army aeroplanists in comparison with the well-trained squadrons of France and Germany. As regards machines, we possessed at this time about a dozen, most of them obsolete, being hopelessly outmatched by France, Germany, and Russia. End of third section.